The wind does not cross the steppe in gusts, but in long, unbroken movements that seem older than direction itself. It presses the grass into waves without sound, then releases it, then presses again, as if testing the patience of the land. Morning emerges slowly. Frost loosens from the earth not all at once but in scattered retreats, leaving dark patches of exposed soil between pale, rigid strands of grass. Nothing changes suddenly here. Change arrives through repetition. Smoke rises from low hearths long before voices carry. Fire burns close to the ground, held within shallow pits ringed by stone blackened from many seasons of heat. The smoke does not climb straight upward. It bends, pulled sideways by the same steady wind that shapes everything else. Even warmth must travel carefully. Hoofprints remain visible where the ground holds last night's hardness. Paths do not announce themselves through construction. They appear where passage has become habit. The steppe remembers movement more reliably than intention. Encampments stand with measured distance between them, never crowded, never entirely separate. Felt walls absorb the cold of night and release it reluctantly. Ropes tighten as the air shifts. Wood creaks with temperature. Nothing is fixed except the necessity of adjustment. Men move early but without urgency. Motion follows rhythm rather than command. Water is checked. Animals are counted. Harnesses are examined not for display but for endurance. Labor begins where survival requires it, not where ambition suggests it. Among these movements, Möngke walks without distinction. His steps follow the same hardened ground as the herdsman, the same narrow paths formed by long use. He pauses where others pause. He observes what others observe. The morning offers no recognition of rank, only exposure to the same cold air and the same steady wind. His attention rests on small things: a loosened strap, a cracked length of wood near a fire pit, a shallow rut forming where carts have passed repeatedly through damp soil. None of these matters alone. Together they form pattern. Pattern becomes burden. Responsibility does not appear as command. It appears as awareness that nothing maintains itself. Order requires tending before it requires authority. He watches the distribution of labor across the encampment. Who repairs before being told? Who delays until asked? Who notices strain in animals before fatigue becomes collapse? These observations accumulate quietly. Governance begins in recognition of repetition. The steppe offers no protection from neglect. What is not maintained dissolves into weather. Rope frays, wood splits, pathways vanish beneath new growth, fire extinguishes if not fed. Stability exists only where attention persists. Movement along the wider roads increases with the thaw. Traders pass at measured intervals, not in caravans large enough to strain the land but in steady succession. Their presence leaves marks deeper than hooves alone. Exchange alters rhythm. Goods move where once only animals passed. The roads widen not by decree but by use. Markets do not gather within walls. They form where stopping becomes practical. A slight rise in ground. A bend in a water path. A place where wind weakens just enough to allow extended rest. Here goods change hands. Here information moves more quickly than objects. Möngke observes these temporary concentrations of activity with careful distance. Trade reveals strain within systems faster than conflict. Where exchange falters, imbalance grows. Where imbalance grows, pressure follows. Justice in this land is not performed. It is maintained through expectation. Disputes settle first through custom, then through mediation, only rarely through force. Each resolution leaves behind an impression, like hoofprints pressed into damp soil. Over time, these impressions become pathways others follow. He notes where expectation fails, where habit no longer resolves tension, where voices rise more quickly than before. Disorder rarely begins with violence. It begins with uncertainty about what will happen next. Labor expands with season. Herds spread farther across open ground. Camps shift position gradually, never abruptly. Movement must remain predictable for survival to remain possible. Even migration follows memory more than decision. Responsibility gathers around continuity, not conquest, not expansion. Continuity alone demands constant attention. At night the fires burn lower, their light held close against the surrounding darkness. Wind presses against felt walls with steady pressure, testing seams, testing knots, testing patience. Inside, warmth is never abundant. It is preserved. Möngke remains awake longer than others, not from unrest but from calculation. Each system he observes exists in fragile alignment. Remove attention, and alignment weakens. Strengthen control too sharply, and movement becomes rigid. Rigidity fractures more easily than flexibility. Power here must bend with the wind or break beneath it. Days pass through repetition rather than distinction. Frost withdraws, grass softens, paths deepen, smoke thickens with increased burning. Nothing signals transformation except accumulation. Responsibility grows heavier not because of sudden demand, but because stability reveals how much depends upon its preservation. He begins to measure not what exists but what might fail, where water grows scarce earlier than expected, where roads narrow unexpectedly, where traders hesitate longer before departure, where labor slows for reasons not yet visible. These are not crises, they are warnings. Governance begins before crisis becomes visible. The steppe stretches unchanged beyond sight, yet within its apparent sameness, imbalance gathers silently. Fire requires tending, roads require watching, markets require trust. Stone holds heat only if placed correctly. Wind tests everything without intention. Möngke understands this not as insight but as condition. Leadership does not emerge from ambition. It emerges from the impossibility of ignoring what sustains life. Night settles again across the open land. Fires dim to embers. Wind continues without pause. Hoofprints harden where the ground cools. Smoke drifts low, spreading thin across the darkened plain. Nothing announces the beginning of governance. It forms where attention refuses to withdraw. The wind moves across the steppe as it always has, shaping what endures by pressing constantly against what does not. Morning does not arrive as light alone. It arrives as sound returning in fragments, leather tightening, hooves shifting against packed ground, the low breath of animals rising into air still cold from night. Frost breaks not with noise but with surrender, loosening its hold where warmth lingers longest, beneath ash, beneath trampled paths, beneath the weight of long-standing structures. Möngke moves through the encampment before the fires are fully revived. His steps follow no fixed route, yet his movement is never without direction. He pauses where strain gathers, where rope has darkened from repeated handling, where the ground has sunk slightly beneath the pressure of stored weight. He does not search for disorder. He notices where order requires effort. His clothing bears no mark of ceremony, thick fabric shaped by wear more than design, boots stiffened by long use, gloves marked by handling tools rather than weapons. He walks with the posture of someone measuring distance not by length, but by consequence. A young horse resists harnessing near the outer ring of the camp. Its agitation is not violent, only persistent. A small irregularity in the strap, nearly invisible, presses where it should not. One adjustment restores stillness. The animal settles. Labor resumes. No command is given. Correction replaces instruction. Responsibility appears most clearly where interruption is smallest. He observes the pattern of morning distribution. Water carried first to animals that traveled farthest the previous day. Grain measured not by abundance but by necessity. Firewood allocated according to wind exposure rather than rank. Each decision reflects memory more than authority. Custom preserves continuity, but custom must be watched. Along the outer path, carts prepare to depart. Their wheels cut shallow impressions into soil softened by thaw. These impressions will deepen if repeated. If deep enough, they will gather water. If water gathers, passage will slow. If passage slows, exchange falters. Roads do not fail all at once. They weaken through accumulation. Möngke kneels where the soil yields too easily beneath pressure. He presses his palm into the ground, feeling not moisture alone but structure beneath it. Weight must be redirected before the path reshapes itself into obstacle. A small diversion now prevents greater repair later. Governance begins where prevention replaces correction. Trade resumes with the season's gradual warming. Merchants arrive carrying goods preserved through cold months, salt wrapped in layered cloth, dried meat hardened against decay, tools reshaped during winter confinement. Each object represents labor extended across distance and time. Exchange requires trust sustained beyond visibility. Goods move farther than those who produce them. Agreement must therefore outlast presence. Möngke watches transactions from slight distance, never interrupting their flow. He observes hesitation more closely than eagerness. Where hands pause before acceptance, where measures are checked twice instead of once, where eyes remain lowered longer than custom requires, trust erodes quietly. Its repair demands more than enforcement. The market forms not as structure but as pattern, a circle of space left open by repeated gathering, ground pressed flat by standing feet, ash scattered where temporary fires burned for warmth or cooking. When people depart, only the altered surface remains proof of order without permanence. He walks the empty circle after dispersal. The ground reveals what voices conceal. Uneven pressure marks where conflict stood longer than exchange. Deepened impressions where burdens were set down with fatigue rather than care. These traces speak without sound. Systems reveal themselves most clearly after activity ends. Labor spreads outward as herds move to new grazing ranges. Camps adjust gradually, shifting position by measured distances that preserve familiarity. Nothing relocates abruptly. Stability requires continuity of orientation as much as location. Children memorize pathways not by map, but by repetition. The position of wind against their faces, the angle of light across the ground at certain hours. Memory anchors movement more securely than markers. Möngke notes where memory begins to fail, where new routes cross older ones, where returning travelers hesitate before choosing direction. Expansion alters understanding before it alters landscape. Growth demands guidance before confusion becomes danger. Justice remains largely unseen. Disputes resolved quickly leave little mark. But when resolution slows, signs accumulate. Voices carry farther. Groups linger in tighter formations. Tools remain unused while attention shifts toward grievance. Conflict does not arrive fully formed. It gathers through delay. One disagreement emerges over grazing sequence along a narrow stretch of recovering grassland. No violence occurs, but timing matters. If animals feed too soon, the ground weakens. If too late, hunger strains endurance. Both outcomes threaten stability. Möngke listens without intervening immediately. He measures not the claims alone, but the rhythm of speech, the spacing of breath, the willingness of each side to pause. Resolution must restore pattern, not merely silence dispute. Restraint prevents escalation more effectively than force. He establishes sequence through rotation rather than division. Each group moves in turn, returning after defined intervals long enough to permit regrowth. The rule does not favor strength. It favors sustainability. Precedent forms quietly. Future conflicts will remember this pattern even if they forget its origin. Evening returns through gradual dimming rather than sudden darkness. Fires ignite again in shallow pits. their light trembling under constant wind. Smoke moves low across the ground, tracing invisible currents that shift from hour to hour. Möngke remains seated near one such fire, not in isolation but in measured stillness. The day's adjustments settle into memory. Each correction reduces immediate strain, yet reveals deeper complexity beneath. Order achieved once does not endure by itself. Fatigue arrives not from labor alone, but from sustained attention. To observe continuously is to carry weight unseen by others. The mind must hold multiple patterns at once: movement of herds, strength of roads, reliability of exchange, fairness of judgment. Leadership is accumulation, never release. Night deepens. Wind continues its unbroken passage across the open land. Fires sink slowly into embers, their heat preserved beneath layers of ash. Beyond the circle of light, the steppe extends without boundary, shaped only by pressure and time. Möngke rises once more before resting. He walks the perimeter of the encampment, tracing its outline not by sight but by memory. Each structure stands where necessity placed it. Each gap exists where movement requires passage. Nothing here remains still because everything here must endure. The wind presses against felt walls, against rope, against exposed skin. It does not choose what to test. It tests everything equally. Stability survives not by resisting the wind, but by adjusting without ceasing. The land changes slowly, but its changes are never without meaning. Spring does not arrive as warmth alone. It arrives as instability beneath the surface. Frozen ground softens unevenly, releasing what it held too tightly through winter. Paths once firm begin to loosen. Wheel tracks deepen where they had once passed lightly. The steppe does not become weaker, only more responsive. Pressure now leaves clearer memory. Möngke walks these altered paths in silence, noticing how the earth receives weight differently than before. Each step presses slightly deeper than expected. The ground yields, then settles. This yielding concerns him more than hardness ever did. Hard ground resists and cracks. Soft ground reshapes. What reshapes must be guided, or it will form its own order. He follows the main route that binds the moving encampments to one another. Not a road marked by stone or boundary, but a corridor of repeated passage. Grass along its edges grows shorter, not from design but from habit. Hooves strike here more often. Wheels turn here more frequently. The land remembers where people depend on certainty. Dependence creates responsibility long before it creates authority. Caravans begin arriving in greater number as the season advances. Their approach is visible first as faint movement on the horizon, then as dust carried low by wind. Distance reveals motion long before sound travels. Möngke watches the line of their progress, measuring intervals between arrivals. The spacing is irregular. Some arrive burdened but steady. Others come strained, animals exhausted, loads shifted unevenly from long passage over softened ground. Movement itself has begun to cost more. He kneels beside a cart whose wheel rim shows signs of warping. Not broken, not yet, but pressure has been uneven. Wood remembers imbalance. The merchant who owns it has compensated through constant adjustment, tightening bindings, redistributing weight. Temporary correction has replaced structural repair. Temporary correction multiplies future strain. Möngke does not rebuke the merchant. He studies the wheel, then the soil beneath its path, then the distance the cart has traveled since last maintenance. The pattern is clear. Routes that once supported uninterrupted travel now require staged movement, shorter intervals, more frequent pauses, deliberate reinforcement of load-bearing parts. Continuity of movement must be restructured before failure becomes visible. He orders no grand change. Instead, small stations begin to form along longer routes, not permanent structures. Only designated places where travelers are expected to halt, examine, redistribute, repair. These stations are marked not by walls, but by memory, locations where the ground is firmer, where water lies near the surface, where wind exposure remains moderate. Expectation reshapes behavior more effectively than enforcement. Merchants begin arriving at these intervals without instruction repeated. They inspect their equipment because the journey itself now demands rhythm. Pause, repair, continue. The pattern spreads quietly, carried by necessity rather than decree. Order grows strongest when it appears to arise from the land itself. Within the encampment, labor shifts to match the season's demands. Winter tasks of preservation give way to spring tasks of adjustment. Harnesses are restitched, axles rebalanced, storage vessels inspected for swelling where moisture has returned. Every object that endured cold must now endure change. Endurance through one season does not guarantee endurance through the next. Möngke walks among craftsmen working with focused repetition. Hands move in practice cycles, cut, bind, test, reinforce. Their labor contains no spectacle, only precision sustained over time. He studies their tools as closely as their work. Blades worn thin from constant sharpening, handles darkened from repeated grip, materials chosen not for appearance but for resilience under strain. Tools reveal the history of pressure more honestly than words. He notices variation in repair methods across different groups. Some reinforce joints with additional binding. Others replace entire segments rather than mend fractures. Still others rely on rotation, exchanging worn components before weakness spreads. Each method reflects inherited knowledge shaped by prior experience. Variation is not disorder, but variation without comparison prevents improvement. Möngke gathers records of these practices, not as written instruction alone, but as observed outcomes. Which repairs endure longest under renewed travel? Which methods fail when exposed to sustained vibration? Which adjustments reduce strain across entire journeys rather than only immediate segments? Knowledge must move as steadily as goods. Gradually, common practice begins to form, not imposed, not declared, but repeated because it proves effective. Certain bindings preferred, certain materials selected, certain intervals observed. The system does not become rigid. It becomes coherent. Coherence preserves flexibility without surrendering stability. Beyond the encampment's outer range, grazing lands present a different challenge. Winter's rest has allowed growth, but new grass remains fragile. Herds drawn too early weaken the ground. Herds delayed too long strain their own strength. Balance must be maintained not by fixed schedule, but by observation of subtle change, color of shoots, firmness of soil beneath hoof, moisture retained below surface layers. The land speaks before it fails. Möngke rides slowly across these recovering fields, watching how animals spread themselves without guidance, drawn by instinct toward areas of stronger growth. Their movement forms patterns that shift daily, responding to what cannot be seen from distance alone. Instinct sustains survival, but instinct does not account for accumulation. He marks rotational grazing boundaries not with visible markers, but through cycles of movement reinforced over time. Herds return to certain areas only after intervals sufficient for renewal. The land recovers not by command, but by patience structured into habit. Patience becomes policy when repeated without interruption, yet not all pressures emerge from nature. Disputes begin to surface over access to transport animals required for expanding trade routes. Some groups maintain stronger breeding lines. Others depend on exchange or temporary borrowing. Demand grows faster than availability. Scarcity sharpens awareness of ownership. One evening, tension gathers around a group whose animals have been retained beyond agreed duration. No violence erupts, but silence thickens, movement slow, eyes remain fixed longer than custom permits. The air carries weight not from threat but from withheld expectation. Delay becomes its own form of conflict. Möngke listens as accounts of obligation and necessity are presented. Each claim contains truth shaped by perspective. One group requires animals to maintain transport commitments. Another insists on restoration of prior balance. Both depend on continuity. Both fear interruption. Need does not cancel need. He does not divide the animals. Division solves nothing when demand continues. Instead, he establishes shared maintenance obligations tied to usage duration. Those who hold animals longer must sustain them more fully, feeding, conditioning, rotating workload to preserve long-term strength. Responsibility must travel with benefit. This principle spreads beyond transport animals. Tools borrowed must return strengthened. Paths used heavily must be repaired by those who depend on them most. Storage utilized beyond customary share must be reinforced proportionally. Use generates obligation. Fire burns each night as it always has, but its presence now carries different meaning. Not merely warmth, not merely light. Fire reveals the residue of each day's labor, tools placed near its edge to dry, bindings tightened in its glow, maps traced in ash by those planning movement at dawn. Fire gathers what the day disperses. Möngke sits beside these fires, not to rest alone, but to observe how routine reshapes itself under sustained pressure. Each adjustment made earlier in the season now produces visible effect, movement steadier, repair more efficient, disputes resolved earlier before they gather strength. Stability grows quietly when systems interlock. Yet beneath this order, fatigue accumulates. Not sudden exhaustion, but gradual weight carried by those who must watch continuously. Every improvement requires maintenance. Every established pattern requires monitoring against slow drift back toward imbalance. Nothing that functions well remains unattended for long. At night, wind crosses the open ground as it always has, passing through rope, felt, exposed earth. It presses against everything equally, structures, animals, bodies, firelight itself. Its movement cannot be prevented, only endured through adaptation. Möngke walks the perimeter once more, as he has done each evening. The encampment breathes in steady rhythm, movement slowed, not stilled. Systems formed through countless small decisions now hold together through shared expectation. But expectation must be renewed daily or it dissolves without warning. The step holds memory in silence. Pressure leaves mark. Movement leaves trace. Repetition leaves pattern. And pattern, once formed, shapes every future step taken across the same ground. Summer does not arrive with sudden heat. It gathers slowly in layers the land cannot refuse. Moisture withdraws first from the surface, then from the shallow roots, then from the deeper places where water lingers longest. Color changes not all at once, but in patches. Green dulls into muted tones. Soil hardens where movement is constant and fractures where it is not. The step tightens under the sun. Wind moves differently now. In spring it carried scent of thaw and growth. In summer it carries dust. Fine particles lift from worn ground and travel low across open space, settling along the edges of paths, inside folds of fabric, across the surface of stored grain. Nothing remains untouched by what the air gathers. Movement leaves residue. Residue accumulates into burden. Möngke rides the outer routes that connect distant encampments, watching how dryness changes distance itself. Where spring softened ground and slowed passage, summer hardens it unevenly. Some stretches allow rapid travel. Others crumble beneath weight, breaking into loose fragments that shift under hooves and wheels. Speed becomes unpredictable. Caravans now move in bursts, accelerating across firm stretches, hesitating where the surface gives way. Rhythm breaks, timing falters. What once required endurance now demands constant recalculation. Continuity depends on knowing where certainty ends. At one crossing where several routes converge, dust hangs in the air long after travelers have passed. Movement concentrates here. Paths overlap, diverge, rejoin. Each direction carries its own pressure, yet all leave marks in the same ground. The surface has become brittle, worn thin by repetition. When too many rely on the same passage, the passage begins to fail them. Möngke dismounts and kneels beside a fracture spreading through the hardened soil, not a deep break but widening. Each wheel that crosses presses edges apart. Each hoof dislodges more fragments. The path does not collapse at once. It erodes gradually, becoming less capable of bearing the weight it invites. Overuse destroys silently. He orders no immediate closure. Movement cannot simply stop. Instead, alternate routes are cleared nearby, not replacements, but diversions that reduce concentrated strain. Travelers are guided outward, spreading pressure across broader ground. Distribution preserves what concentration destroys. The adjustment appears small, yet its effects travel far. Dust no longer gathers so densely. Wheel tracks deepen less quickly. Fractures slow their widening. What had been one corridor of necessity becomes several channels of shared burden. Balance requires redirection, not resistance. But disorder does not arise from land alone. With increased movement comes increased opportunity for imbalance among people themselves. Goods now travel in greater volume, and where goods travel, measures of value follow close behind. Measurement introduces comparison. Comparison invites dispute. At a trading point near the river's narrowing bend, disagreement forms over weight and exchange. Grain measured against cloth, metal against livestock. Each side believes the scale favors the other. Not through deception alone, but through difference in standard stones used for weighing shaped by different traditions. Balances constructed with slight variation in arm length. Cords stretched unevenly over time. Small differences multiply into distrust. Voices remain controlled, but posture stiffens. Hands rest longer on goods not yet released. The air around the market tightens, not with anger, but with refusal to yield. Uncertainty halts movement more effectively than force. Möngke arrives as exchanges slow into stillness. He observes the scales first, not the people. He lifts each stone weight, testing density, shape, wear along edges. Some have been smoothed by long use. Others retain sharper surfaces, losing fewer fragments over time. No two match exactly. A measure that shifts cannot sustain trust. He orders the crafting of standardized weights from uniform metal, shaped and distributed from a single source. Not to replace all existing measures at once, but to establish reference, a known constant against which variation may be compared. Consistency begins with one fixed point. Markets gradually adopt these reference weights. Traders still use their own measures, but comparison becomes immediate. Discrepancy no longer hides within custom. It becomes visible, and what is visible can be adjusted. Transparency reduces conflict before it forms. Yet another disturbance spreads beyond measurement. Reports arrive of caravans altering routes to avoid customary inspection points. Not theft, not rebellion. Only avoidance, an effort to shorten travel, to bypass delay, to preserve advantage gained through speed. Efficiency pursued without structure erodes shared stability. Möngke does not pursue them with riders. Pursuit would treat movement itself as a fence. Instead, he examines why inspection points are avoided, waiting times too long, procedures inconsistent. Some caravans halted repeatedly while others passed quickly. Irregular enforcement breeds evasion. He restructures inspection into predictable intervals tied to distance traveled rather than location alone. Every caravan pauses after fixed passage length, regardless of route. Inspection becomes part of rhythm, not interruption. When obligation becomes expected, resistance fades. Summer deepens. Heat presses downward even at dusk. Fires burn smaller now, used less for warmth than for preparation and repair. Their smoke rises thin and straight into unmoving air. Stillness reveals tension more clearly than motion. One evening, a herd returns with signs of strain, not from distance, but from uneven terrain where newly hardened ground has cut into hooves unaccustomed to such sharp surfaces. Animals move carefully, weight shifted, pace slowed. Hardness wounds differently than softness. Herdsmen gather around the injured animals, examining damage with quiet concern. No sudden crisis. Only gradual harm revealed through repetition of contact with altered ground. Environment changes faster than habit adapts. Möngke orders sections of heavily traveled grazing routes lightly broken and loosened by controlled tilling, not cultivation, but softening. The ground is disturbed deliberately to prevent it from becoming too rigid for sustained passage. Sometimes stability requires disruption applied with intention. Labor spreads across these areas, turning surface just enough to reduce cutting edges while preserving overall firmness. The change appears subtle, yet herds move more evenly once the adjustment is complete. Intervention must match scale of problem, not exceed it. Despite these corrections, tension accumulates elsewhere. A group of traders arrives with goods diminished beyond expected loss, not taken, not stolen. Simply gone through gradual miscount, shifting containers, repeated transfers between carriers along extended routes. Loss through diffusion is hardest to trace. Each stage of movement had seemed minor. A small reduction here, a minor adjustment there. No single point responsible, yet total loss now significant enough to threaten future exchange. What is unrecorded cannot be protected. Möngke introduces sequential tallying at each transfer, not elaborate record, only simple marking carried forward with goods themselves. Each stage confirms quantity received and passed onward. Reduction becomes visible immediately, not discovered at journey's end. Awareness prevents accumulation of unnoticed error. The system spreads quickly because it demands little and clarifies much. Carriers become guardians not only of goods, but of continuity between stages. Responsibility travels with the object itself. Custody is a chain. Weakness at any link weakens all. Night after night, wind returns across the steppe, carrying finer dust than before. It settles on stone, on leather, on skin warmed by long labor. The land grows harsher in surface, yet more ordered in use. Routes stabilized, measures clarified, exchanges regularized. But each correction reveals new fragility. Möngke feels the weight of this unfolding pattern. Disorder never vanishes. It shifts, adapting to the very structures built to contain it. Each improvement reduces one form of instability while exposing another waiting beneath. Control is not conquest, it is continuous adjustment. He stands at the edge of the encampment as darkness gathers, watching distant fires flicker where other groups settle for the night. Each flame marks effort sustained, systems maintained, pressure absorbed and redistributed. Across the vastness, countless small acts hold the structure together. The land endures heat without protest. The wind carries dust without memory of where it lifted. Paths bear weight without choosing who travels them. Only those who govern must remember every strain that passes through what they sustain. Burden belongs to those who prevent collapse before it begins. The movement of an empire rarely stops all at once. It slows unevenly, like a great herd descending toward water, each animal sensing the hesitation of the others before lowering its head. After the campaigns, after the proclamations, after the long distances measured not in miles but in exhaustion, there came a period when the world did not grow quieter, it only seemed to listen more closely. Across the steppe, riders still moved along familiar routes. Messengers still carried sealed commands bound in leather. Herds still shifted with the grass, and smoke still rose from encampments that had never known permanence. Yet something had altered in the unseen spaces where decisions formed. Power had begun to gather inward, folding upon itself like cloth drawn too tightly at the center. Within the imperial court, silence had weight. It settled in the pauses between words. It lingered after judgments were spoken. It stretched longest in the moments before agreement. No one named this change aloud. But each person felt it, in the careful phrasing of counsel, in the measured way eyes moved across a gathering, in the growing awareness that conquest alone no longer determined the future. Territory had been taken faster than it could be shaped. Command had spread faster than understanding. And now the empire stood not at the edge of expansion, but at the threshold of definition. What it meant to rule such immensity had no precedent. Those who had grown strong in motion now faced the strain of stillness. Generals who once read meaning in dust clouds and distant banners now studied expressions, alliances, and the fragile architecture of influence. Victory on open ground had been visible, undeniable. Authority within walls was another matter entirely. It shifted with mood, with memory, with the quiet persistence of ambition. In the capital, stone and timber bore witness to this new tension. Structures built to endure now enclosed debates that could not easily be resolved. Voices lowered not from weakness but from caution. Every statement implied another question. Every decision created new balances that required guarding. The empire had been forged through momentum, but momentum alone could not sustain it. Those closest to power understood this first. They felt the narrowing path between unity and fracture. Each decree needed acceptance across lands that did not share language, custom, or expectation. Each appointment carried consequences that reached beyond loyalty into lineage, rivalry, and long-held grievance. The work of governing demanded a patience that conquest had never required. Outside the court, the wider world adjusted in its own way. Conquered cities reopened their markets. Caravans resumed movement along roads that had once been uncertain or perilous. Traders calculated risk differently now, not by the danger of bandits, but by the stability of authority. Stability itself had become a commodity, something measured not in coin but in consistency. Yet peace imposed from distance always carried strain. Local leaders learned to read imperial intention through fragments, through tax demands, through envoys whose authority varied in ways not immediately visible, through policies shaped far away by concerns they could not fully perceive. Compliance did not always mean acceptance. Order did not always mean trust. The empire held, but it held through effort. Among the ruling family, memory remained the most powerful force of all. The past was not distant. It lived in every comparison, every expectation of strength, every fear of decline. The achievements that had made dominion possible now cast long shadows over those who inherited its maintenance. To preserve what had been won required a different kind of endurance, one less visible, less celebrated, but no less demanding. Leadership now meant resisting fragmentation not only in territory, but in purpose. Some sensed the danger early. They recognized that conquest unified through direction, forward, outward, always toward the next horizon. Governance offered no such clarity. It demanded restraint, compromise, repetition. It required accepting that strength could not always be displayed through force. Sometimes it had to be demonstrated through continuity, through the simple fact that authority remained unbroken from one season to the next. This form of power was quieter, and therefore harder to trust. Beyond the central court, distant commanders watched carefully. Each awaited signs of change that might alter their standing. Loyalty endured, but it was no longer instinctive. It had to be reaffirmed, reinforced, occasionally negotiated. Messages traveled great distances not only to convey orders, but to reassure, to clarify, to maintain the delicate alignment that vast rule required. Even the land itself seemed to respond differently now. Roads that once carried armies now bore administrators, envoys, and tax collectors. The rhythm of movement altered. Where urgency had once driven speed, responsibility now dictated persistence. The empire did not surge forward. It pressed downward, rooting itself into the ground it had claimed. This transformation was gradual, so gradual that those living within it rarely recognized its full shape, but the shift was real. The generation that had known only expansion was giving way to one that would define permanence. The question no longer concerned how far the empire could reach, but how deeply it could endure. Distance had been conquered, time had not, and time demanded proof of stability again and again. In the evenings, when activity receded and wind moved softly across the open land beyond the capital, the illusion of simplicity returned. The steppe remained vast, indifferent, unchanged in appearance. Grass bent and rose, herds moved in patient arcs, the sky stretched without boundary. Yet beneath that familiar horizon lay a structure more complex than anything the steppe had ever held before, an empire not merely of movement, but of maintenance. Not merely of strength, but of balance. Its future would depend on whether stillness could be mastered as completely as motion once had been. And within that stillness, decisions were already forming, quiet, deliberate, irreversible. Power does not remain abstract for long. If it cannot be seen, it must be arranged. If it cannot be arranged, it begins to dissolve. In the years that followed conquest, authority slowly acquired form. What had once existed in motion, in the surge of riders, in the sudden arrival of banners on distant horizons, now had to be made visible through structure. Rule required presence even where the ruler did not stand. It required systems that endured beyond memory of the moment they were established. This was the labor that defined the new era. Across territories that stretched farther than any single journey could encompass, officials began to mark boundaries not of land alone, but of responsibility. Records were kept with increasing care. Names were written, counted, compared. Obligations were measured not merely in loyalty, but in grain, in livestock, in labor, in the steady and predictable movement of resources toward a center that depended on reliability more than speed. Where conquest had been decisive, governance was cumulative. Each act of administration layered upon another, building patterns that could not be seen all at once, but gradually shaped the experience of rule. Messengers carried not only commands but clarification. Instructions multiplied, refined, amended. What had once been resolved through immediate judgment now passed through channels designed to preserve order across distance. This process demanded interpretation. And interpretation created power of its own. Those entrusted to carry out decisions inevitably shaped them. A directive issued in one place arrived elsewhere altered by circumstance, by necessity, by the limits of knowledge. Authority flowed outward, but never without transformation. Even obedience contained variation. Even precision allowed room for adjustment. Thus governance spread not as a single unbroken force, but as a network of responses to reality. The imperial center recognized this tension. To command was not enough. Command had to be understood. To be understood, it had to be repeated. To be repeated, it had to be translated across language, across custom, across landscapes that shaped behavior as surely as law ever could. In this constant translation lay both resilience and vulnerability. The empire learned to stabilize itself through regularity. Roots were maintained with deliberate care. Stations of rest and exchange appeared at intervals determined not by chance but by calculation. Movement, once the instrument of conquest, became the instrument of cohesion. Information traveled with a steadiness that resembled circulation within a living body. Messages moved, responses returned, adjustments followed. The system breathed, yet breath could quicken or falter. Distance remained the great adversary. Not distance alone as measured across the earth, but distance in perception, the slow distortion that occurred whenever authority extended beyond immediate sight. Reports might delay. Conditions might shift between one instruction and the next. A decision suitable for one moment could become burdensome in another. Thus vigilance became perpetual. Within the court, attention turned increasingly toward anticipation. Leaders no longer asked only what had occurred, but what might occur if left unattended. Governance required imagination of consequences that had not yet emerged. The ability to foresee strain became as valuable as the ability to impose control. This altered the nature of leadership itself. Strength, once proven through decisive action, now revealed itself through endurance of complexity. To maintain unity across difference demanded constant adjustment without visible instability. Too much rigidity invited fracture. Too much flexibility invited uncertainty. Authority had to feel both firm and adaptable, a balance difficult to achieve and more difficult still to preserve. Those responsible for maintaining this balance rarely experienced rest. Beyond the structures of administration, the people who lived under imperial rule developed their own forms of adaptation. Some found advantage in stability. Trade expanded where safety could be predicted. Crafts flourished where supply remained uninterrupted. Movement across regions grew more frequent, not driven by fear of invasion but by expectation of continuity. Yet adaptation was never uniform. Some communities accepted order as protection. Others endured it as pressure. Compliance could mask resistance. Participation could conceal withdrawal. Beneath the visible operations of governance, countless small negotiations unfolded daily, between local custom and distant command, between habit and obligation, between memory of autonomy and reality of incorporation. The empire encompassed all these tensions at once. It grew not quieter but more intricate. Even the landscape began to bear marks of permanence. Roads hardened through repeated use. Settlements expanded in patterns shaped by administrative necessity. Regions once defined only by seasonal movement acquired fixed points of exchange and authority. Geography itself became organized according to the needs of rule. And yet the steppe remained. Beyond every structured corridor of power, open land stretched in silent continuity. Wind moved as it always had, indifferent to decree or boundary. Grass bent beneath passing herds without regard for tax or census. The vastness that had given rise to expansion still surrounded the empire that expansion had produced. This contrast never disappeared. It lingered in memory, in instinct, in the awareness that structure had been built upon movement, and might, under certain conditions, yield again to it. Those who governed understood that stability did not erase origin, it merely overlaid it. Thus the work of preservation continued without pause. Authority required reinforcement not because it was weak, but because its scale demanded constant renewal. Each season tested continuity. Each generation reinterpreted obligation. The empire endured not through a single act of will, but through countless acts of maintenance repeated across time. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, rule acquired rhythm. Orders issued, responses gathered, adjustments made. Resources flowed, were distributed and returned. Alliances formed, were tested, reaffirmed. The system did not stand still, it cycled. Stability emerged not from immobility but from regulated motion, controlled, measured, sustained. This was the new form of strength. No longer the thunder of hooves alone, but the quiet persistence of coordination. No longer expansion without limit, but endurance with intention. The empire had learned to hold what it had taken. Whether it could continue to hold, it would depend not on conquest, but on the fragile and continuous shaping of authority itself. Cold returned before anyone remarked upon its arrival. It did not descend suddenly. It gathered first in the hollows where sunlight lingered least, then along the edges of roads hardened by long use. Then in the stillness that settled over stations, where messengers paused only briefly before moving on again. Frost formed in thin, uneven patterns, tracing the shapes of structures that had not existed a generation before. The land received the season without resistance. It always had. Within the ordered networks of governance, movement slowed but did not stop. Records continued to accumulate. Measures were taken again and again, not because they had failed, but because their accuracy depended on repetition. Each tally required renewal. Each obligation required reaffirmation. Stability, once established, revealed its true nature, not a state to be achieved, but a condition to be maintained. Those who bore responsibility understood this with growing clarity. Years had passed since reform first took shape as intention rather than necessity. The changes that had once demanded constant attention now operated with a degree of familiarity. Procedures that had seemed fragile began to feel durable. Officials who had learned their duties through trial now carried them through habit. Systems moved forward not through urgency alone, but through continuity. Yet continuity altered those who sustained it. Fatigue did not announce itself through collapse. It appeared instead in the small adjustments of daily practice. Decisions once made with long deliberation were rendered more swiftly. Uncertainties once examined from many angles were accepted as part of the larger pattern. Endurance produced efficiency. Efficiency carried its own cost. Responsibility pressed inward even as authority extended outward. Those who governed began to recognize the limits of individual vigilance. No single mind could oversee what had been constructed. No single presence could ensure the precision of every exchange, every record, every judgment rendered far beyond the horizon. Trust in structure replaced reliance on constant supervision. Systems were expected to function even in absence. Absence, once unthinkable, became inevitable. Time advanced through quiet transformations. Faces familiar within the centers of administration grew lined and deliberate. Movements slowed where once they had been sharp with urgency. Memory lengthened, holding not only present obligation but the recollection of earlier uncertainty. The years when order had not yet proven itself capable of endurance. Younger figures entered the work already shaped by what had been established. They did not remember the absence of structure. They did not recall the uncertainty of unmeasured obligation or unregulated movement. For them, governance existed not as an achievement but as a condition of existence. Roads were expected to connect. Records were expected to account. Authority was expected to operate beyond immediate sight. Inheritance had taken form. Instruction passed not through proclamation alone, but through demonstration repeated over years. Methods were shown, corrected, refined. Errors were absorbed into process. Precedents accumulated, shaping response before conscious deliberation began. What had once required invention now required preservation. Preservation demanded restraint no less than creation had. There remained always the possibility of expansion, new territories to incorporate, new populations to organize, new resources to measure and distribute. Yet the experience of governance had altered the meaning of growth. Expansion without integration threatened imbalance. Extension without consolidation weakened coherence. To enlarge without strengthening what already existed invited disorder to reappear in subtle forms. Thus growth itself became measured. Attention turned increasingly toward equilibrium, the careful maintenance of relationships between distant regions, between local custom and central authority, between movement and settlement. The empire had become not merely vast, but interdependent. Disturbance in one place could travel outward through channels once designed for stability. This awareness produced caution where once momentum had prevailed. Beyond the administrative centers, ordinary life continued its own cycles. Markets opened and closed according to season. Herds moved across familiar ranges, fields yield according to patterns older than empire itself. Governance shaped conditions, but did not replace the rhythms of survival. People adapted to rule as they adapted to climate, adjusting, enduring, incorporating what could not be avoided. Some changes passed almost unnoticed. A child grew to adulthood without recalling a time when roads had been uncertain. A trader calculated distance in terms of reliable stations rather than unmarked terrain. A local official rendered judgment by referring to precedents recorded long before his own birth. Stability entered memory not as an event, but as a background condition against which all else unfolded. Memory itself shifted. Those who had witnessed transformation most directly began to sense its completion not through triumph, but through normalization. What had once required vision now required continuation. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The labor that had reshaped governance no longer appeared as labor at all. This recognition carried quiet weight. Leadership, once defined by the capacity to initiate change, now revealed itself in the willingness to relinquish immediacy. Authority endured only when it could pass from one set of hands to another without rupture. The measure of success became not the magnitude of reform, but the smoothness of transition. Transition approached gradually, without announcement. Responsibilities shifted first in small matters: the oversight of a route, the supervision of a district, the interpretation of a regulation whose application had grown complex through repetition. Experience transferred through observation, correction, silent acknowledgement. No single moment marked the transfer. It unfolded through accumulation. Those who had borne the earliest burden stepped back not because their work was complete, but because continuation required others to assume its weight. The structures they had shaped remained, but their relation to those structures changed. Where once they had guided every adjustment, they now observed adjustments made by others. Where once they had responded directly to uncertainty, they now watched uncertainty addressed through methods they themselves had established. The system moved forward without constant reference to its origin. This was both fulfillment and loss. Fulfillment, because continuity had been secured. Loss, because the immediacy of creation could not be preserved. The intensity that had accompanied each decision, each deliberate act of formation, receded into memory. What remained was endurance, quieter, steadier, less visible. Beyond all human arrangement, the land continued unchanged in its essential character. Wind crossed the open distances with the same long, unbroken motion. It moved along the hardened surfaces of roads, over the roofs of stations, across fields and grazing grounds alike. It passed through spaces shaped by governance without altering its own course. The vastness that had once carried riders outward in conquest now carried only air, season after season. Structures endured within that vastness, but did not contain it. Those who considered the future understood that permanence belonged not to institutions alone, but to the conditions within which institutions existed. No system could command the horizon. No authority could suspend the passage of time. Governance shaped experience but remained subject to forces that preceded and would outlast it. This awareness did not weaken resolve. It refined it. Responsibility came to be understood not as possession, but as stewardship, the temporary holding of order within a world that never ceased its broader motion. Each generation would inherit not control but obligation. Each would maintain what it could, adjust what it must, and relinquish what could not be preserved unchanged. Thus continuity extended beyond individuals. The work of reform, once urgent and immediate, dissolved into the ongoing practice of governance. Its origins became less distinct with each passing year. What remained was structure, rhythm, expectation, patterns embedded deeply enough to endure transition, loss, and renewal alike. Even so, nothing stood entirely still. Stone weathered. Roads required repair. Records faded and were rewritten. Authority shifted in emphasis as circumstances altered. Stability revealed itself not as resistance to change, but as the capacity to absorb change without losing coherence. In this capacity lay the true legacy of what had been built. When at last responsibility passed fully into new hands, it did so without ceremony large enough to capture its significance. There was no single moment when governance began anew. There was only continuation, the same routes traveled, the same measures taken, the same vigilance maintained. The systems endured because they had been shaped to endure. Across the land, winter deepened. Frost thickened where shadows remained longest. Breath lingered briefly in the air before dissolving. The world grew quieter, not empty, but composed. Movement slowed, sound carried farther. Presence became more deliberate. Wind moved steadily across the open ground, touching road and field, stone and grass alike. It passed over all that had been built and all that would remain when building ceased. It marked no boundary, acknowledged no authority, and required no record of its passing. Order rises through effort. Continuity endures through care. But all structure exists within a world that moves without asking permission.